Okay, there we go. Okay, all started. So are we ready? Is everyone ready?
Luck, everyone.
So just good afternoon or good evening, depending on how this goes. Yeah, I'm Matthew Savello, and I'm the chair of the Manhattan Solid Waste Advisory Board. And we, along with the Brooklyn Queens Solid Waste Advisory Boards, are just happy to have you all join us for this important panel discussion this evening. The toxicity of cigarette butt and vape waste is rarely discussed or written about, and environmental dangers are little known by smokers and non-smokers. Each of us passes by thousands of cigarette butts and vape waste cartridges on our sidewalks and our streets daily. So today we're going to hear a compelling discussion from top experts in the country that will help us understand this issue and the importance of passing New York State's S1278 and A4308, the Tobacco Product Waste Reduction Act, sponsored by Senator Kruger and Assemblywoman Griffin. The SWABs take on topics like this year round, and we advance ideas, insights, and initiatives that push forward New York City's zero waste goals. You're all welcome to attend our SWAB free monthly meetings, which are on the second Wednesday of every month, and help us become part of the solution by joining one of our active and dedicated committees. So welcome again, and to introduce our speakers and moderate to this evening's discussion, here is, I'm going to turn it over to Mara Davy Gaines.
Thank you so much, Matt. Hello, everyone. It's so good to see so many of you here. Welcome to today's panel, Cigarette Butts and Vape Waste, a Hidden Environmental Hazard. We are happy to have members of New York City and state government, city agencies, and concerned citizens in our audience today. So thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and let's get to it. As Matt said, my name is Mara Davy Gaines. I am reaching you today from the ancestral home of the Schaghticoke and Munsee Lenape, and I am pleased to be your moderator this evening. I am a Broadway film and television actress based in New York, as well as an environmentalist. I am on the steering committee of the Broadway Green Alliance, and I'm a trained climate reality leader and a student of environmental studies at SUNY Empire State. I would like very much to thank the Solid Waste Advisory Boards of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens for presenting today's event, and specifically to the tireless passion of Joyce Bialik, chair of the Residential Recycling and Reuse Committee, and to her team. So we are here today to talk about issues surrounding cigarette butt and vape waste as it relates to the proposed New York State Tobacco Product Waste Reduction Act, S1278 and A4308. The health hazards of smoking are well documented and widely known, but the environmental and health effects of discarded butts and vape trash are poorly known. Cigarette butts are carelessly tossed away by the billions, and people expect them to magically vanish. These tiny time bombs are saturated with toxins and wash into local waterways and oceans. Cities and countries around the world are addressing this issue, and we are so very glad that New York State is leading once again and considering a law on this issue. We are so honored to have an esteemed panel of professors, researchers, and New York State government staff to clarify the importance of this act. So we're all going to learn a lot here today. Each panelist will present for 7 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A session after the presentations. If you will put your questions in the chat as we go along, then we will be able to call on you after the presentation is over to ask your question aloud. At that point, you can also raise
Mara, you muted yourself.
Apologies. What was the last thing I said? I don't know how that happens.
About the Q&A.
Okay. I wonder if it has like a sensor and I raised my hand and it muted me. I don't know. All right. So anyway, you can put your questions in the chat for a Q&A, or at the end, you can do the fancy raise your hand thing in the Zoom box, and we'll call on you that way as well. But before we start, we would really appreciate it if all of you would add your organization name or affiliation so that we know who is in attendance and where you're from. So to do that, you can just click on the 3 dots in the upper right corner of your photo or video box. And then in the drop down, click rename, and you can add your organization to your name, just as I have done, putting Broadway Green Alliance with my name. Thank you for doing so. And now we are ready for the main event. Let's jump right in. Our first panelist is Dr. Tom Novotny. He is a professor emeritus of epidemiology and biostatistics at the San Diego State University School of Public Health. In 2010, he founded the Cigarette Butt Pollution Project, a research, educational, and advocacy nonprofit organization that addresses tobacco's impact on the environment. He continues to conduct research on tobacco product waste and its impact on the environment and on communities. Dr. Novotny has a long history of tracking the impact of tobacco on the environment and on human health, and the actions the tobacco industry has taken to conceal cigarettes' health and environmental impacts. Dr. Novotny, hello. Would you please explain to all of us the health and environmental impacts of cigarette filters?
Let me get my slides up here. Just one moment, please. And there we go. Thanks very much for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be here talking to you about this significant environmental problem, but it also has certain health implications as well, which I'll try to outline. You're going to hear a lot about some of the chemistry and toxicity issues related to tobacco product waste. And I want to talk a little bit more about some of the potential health and preventable aspects of it. I'm a public health physician, which means we try to look at upstream preventable kinds of solutions to problems such as this, and we'll try to make that clear as we go along. So, yeah, are there health implications of tobacco product waste? Well, we know from laboratory studies that there's an awful lot of toxicity, chemical toxicity, and you'll hear more from Judith about that. There's also a significant amount of information now accumulating about field toxicity, that is, actually rather than in the laboratory in the natural environment, to identify what some of the potential impacts might be. And we don't really have to have reasons of health to actually intervene, because there's something called a precautionary principle, which for me is still very functional in terms of protecting human health as well as animal health and just the condition of the environment by upstream solutions to toxic exposures. So nevertheless, we've seen that cigarette butts actually could be ingested by humans and animals, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. It certainly degrades the natural environment. It's one of the more significant public nuisances, I think, that plagues our urban environments, because, you know, as much as 20 or 30% of urban waste is actually cigarette butt by count. So in the field, we've actually detected things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, carcinogens, that are derived from tobacco products in urban environments, riverbanks, roadsides, beaches, etc. Nicotine, which is the most common chemical picked up in sort of the analytics of tobacco product waste, is actually a plant pesticide, and it actually can contaminate water. 1,000 liters of water with one cigarette butt can make it detectable above the no effect concentration. In other words, there could be effects even in 1,000 liters of water from one cigarette butt. It's detected in river samples downstream from treatment plants, also in even drinking water supplies in many areas. And we've done some research recently here in natural reserves in California, those federally designated reserves that have indications of the tobacco product chemicals in the water, soils, and sediment that are measured in these environments. So yeah, there are some reports from poison control centers that children who are indiscriminate eaters, just like dogs and other animals, have actually consumed cigarette butts. It's been published in the CDC's MMWR journal, and also in veterinary poison control centers, there have been reports of animals. But that's not the main issue. I think what we're really concerned about is what ecotoxicity might result from these butts in the environment, rather than just people consuming them or animals just consuming them. There may be chemical relationships that lead to sublethal effects. That is, not killing people, not killing animals, but getting into the food chain, perhaps causing some increased risk for estrogenicity, tumorigenicity, teratogenesis, other sort of, adverse health effects of chemical toxicity. It may actually bioaccumulate in the food chain if it is ingested by marine animals that we then, through the layers of the food chain might even be possible for humans to absorb. And what we do know is that the chemicals from the toxic waste products can transform by just sitting in the environment into such things. Nicotine, for instance, can transform into something called tobacco-specific nitrosamines, which are carcinogenic. So aside from the sort of chemical toxicity concerns, there are economic concerns. It costs money to clean up or even prevent or even educate people about tobacco product waste. And these are not costs that are borne by the smokers or by the tobacco industry. They're externalities, economic negative externalities that are borne by taxpayers or individuals or voluntary groups. There are secondary costs, which we don't really have a good handle on. And this is where the ecotoxicity, environmental damage, just the loss of pristine environments may have a cost to it. We may be willing to pay to keep these things from happening, but certainly that's not something that we can just ignore as a secondary effect. There have been studies of the economic costs of tobacco product waste. One in San Francisco about a dozen years ago or so found that it took about $6 million a year in direct costs, just in cleanup costs, measuring, the butt waste burden, but also the costs of picking this up as an attributable fraction. And it found that was about $6 million a year. San Francisco passed a litter fee to help recover those costs. It's now actually above $1 since it's been grandfathered along the way to increase with time. So there are economic concerns, and we've been looking at this as a special project here in California with funding from the California Department of Public Health. We hope to develop a model for economic cost evaluation in communities going forward. I want to mention the filter, because this is the issue that I think we're going to be most concerned about. It's plastic. It's made out of cellulose acetate. It is on 99.8% of all cigarettes sold in this country, and more than 90% sold around the world. The main purpose, according to a historian, Robert Proctor, who wrote a great book called Golden Holocaust, was to lower the cost of manufacturing. It's actually cheaper to have the cellulose acetate filter on the tip of a cigarette than to have full tobacco as part of the cigarette. It keeps tobacco bits from entering the mouths of smokers, and this is where filters probably started, whether it was the long sort of filter or rather cigarette holder, but now it also functions in that way. And it convinces people into thinking that filtered brands are somehow safer, and they're not. And this is something that we have now identified as a significant fraud. Not only does it make it easier to smoke and discourage people from quitting, it actually has an effect on cancer. There's a type of cancer called adenocarcinoma, which is found in the periphery of the lungs, which when you inhale against the filtered cigarette, you have to inhale more deeply. It gets to the periphery. And in this graph here, which is a little bit hard to sort of comprehend, I just want to point out the top line, which is the line for adenocarcinoma incidence over time. This has gone up. Cancers have gone down because people have quit smoking, but this particular cancer, with the advent of the cigarette filter over the last 50 years, has gone up in incidence for both men and women. We think, and the Surgeon General of the United States and the National Cancer Institute also feel that it is the design of the cigarette, including the filter, that has probably made this causally related as a risk for smoking filtered cigarettes. Strangely enough, there hasn't been much in the way of a study comparing smokers who use filtered to unfiltered cigarettes. We just did one with a very small pilot study, but what we found is that when you switch smokers from unfiltered, or rather filtered to unfiltered cigarettes, they smoke fewer cigarettes today. They don't like it. There's less satisfaction, less taste, more aversion, more harshness, more negative reinforcement with unfiltered cigarettes. So what this says is that cigarette filters make it easier to smoke. Why do we want that? We don't. We want people to quit. And urinary cotinine, which is the breakdown product of nicotine, don't change between filtered and unfiltered cigarettes. They're not getting more nicotine. We haven't yet been able to analyze the carcinogen exposure during this trial, but that's coming. So right now, what's the general approach to tobacco product waste is PR campaigns, social media included in that, butt cleanups, which really highlight the problem. They, really drive it home when you collect millions of butts. And if you've ever done this, you know how bad it smells. Banning smoking in public places, it has an effect. Of course it does. It denormalizes smoking in general, but it really doesn't solve this problem because it's very place specific. It isn't, the entire city of New York, for instance. Anti-litter laws, yeah, these are in effect in California up to $1,000 for littering, but they don't work because they're very poorly enforced, as are the banning, or rather the outdoor smoking restrictions. The litter fee I mentioned in San Francisco, it's one way of addressing it. Take back and recycling has been considered, but it's really, the logistics of doing something like that with this massive amount of toxic hazardous waste just doesn't make any sense. The tobacco industry likes these downstream approaches, meaning they are happy to involve voluntary groups such as Keep America Beautiful and others to pick up the cigarette butt waste, because then they can make themselves look good about their investment in this environmental sort of remedy. But it doesn't do any good. Even if you pick up 1 million butts a year, there's trillions littered around the world somewhere. Now, again, the upstream approach that I'd like to emphasize, and is now being considered as law, is to get rid of the filter. The cellulose acetate filter has no health benefit. They're designed to accumulate particles. They leach out chemical toxins. You'll hear more about this. And they are unnecessary in terms of a health benefit for smokers. They don't work. It's a fraud. Biodegradable filters have been considered, and I want to just say that that's not the answer. The chemicals will still leach out of them, and people will be more likely to dump these biodegradable filters in the environment than not. So I want to just emphasize again a little bit more about the industry. They are not a stakeholder. They are not meant. They should not be brought to the table to negotiate what the best solution is. They should be regulated. And this is something that we made a mistake here in California. Our legislators started to listen to the tobacco industry when we considered our law on banning the sale of filtered cigarettes a couple of weeks ago. And now that law has been gutted so that it's only applicable to electronic cigarettes, which is great. But the essence of the original law that we proposed over the last year here was to ban the sale of filtered cigarettes. And the industry got their hands into this and caused it to fail. The environmental impact assessment of new products is needed. The FDA is supposed to do this, but they haven't done a very good job on that, and they need to be encouraged to do so. That is, e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products, et cetera. We need to resist any kind of partnerships. The environmental groups that have done this generally don't speak out against them or support these upstream solutions. And we want to point out the evidence for the lack of any sort of effect from these industry-sponsored environmental efforts. They don't work. So I want to conclude by showing my friends here from the Surfers Against Sewage in the UK, who have taken Tucker Carlson's advice, I guess, and demonstrated their rejection of butts on the beach. And I want to thank them for allowing me to use this picture because it really does summarize the message. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for that great summation and for that phenomenal information. I would like to move on to our second panelist, Dr. Judith Weiss. Dr. Weiss is a professor emerita of biology at Rutgers University, where she studied effects of stresses, including pollution, in estuaries for many decades. She's written 4 books for the general public, including one on marine pollution, and technical books, including one that will come out in May about microfiber pollution from textiles. She has served on numerous advisory committees for federal, state, and municipal agencies, and is active in the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations. Dr. Weiss, hello. You are an expert. Hi, you're an expert on plastic microfiber pollution. The United Nations reports that cigarette butts that are not properly disposed of get broken down by factors such as sunlight and moisture, thus releasing microplastics and other chemical toxins which impact ecosystems' health and services. Dr. Weiss, what can you tell us about the environmental effects of microplastics and toxins from cigarette butts in our water?
I'm going to share my screen and hope that this works. Can you see it?
There it is.
Good. Can I just make one little nitpicky comment. People are talking about, well, never mind. I won't do that. I'm going to talk about cigarette butts in the aquatic environment. And well, let me go to here. Okay. Cigarette butts are among the items in litter on the beach. There is an annual, at least before COVID, an annual beach cleanup worldwide that's coordinated by the Nature Conservancy, where people not only pick up stuff from the beach, but they have a data sheet and they write down everything that they found and how many. So they have data worldwide, and the data shows that cigarette butts are the most common item. But of course, if you count things, you've got to realize that cigarette butts are a lot smaller than soda bottles, let's say, but they make up, the most in terms of counts of items in these beach cleanups. There's apparently been a lot of studies in San Francisco since Tom Novotny just talked about San Francisco, and the data from there indicate that people litter about 3 billion filters a year. In New York City is an example of good intentions that went bad when they prohibited smoking in office buildings. Mayor Bloomberg, when he was mayor, prohibited smoking in office buildings. So now people who want to smoke have to go outside to smoke. So they stand outside the building and they drop the butts on the sidewalk. So, I mean, it was a good intention that had some unexpected bad effects. Anyway, we have cigarette butts almost everywhere you go, roads, not just beaches, trails, everywhere. And they affect wildlife. In terms of toxicity, we have an item, we look at cigarette butt. It's made, the butt itself, the filter itself is made out of a plastic, cellulose acetate. And it also then has incorporated in it the toxic chemicals that were in the tobacco. So there have been some fairly crude experiments where you put a smoked cigarette butt in a container of water and put fish in there, and these chemicals are killing fish. These butts, filters particularly, take over 10 years to disintegrate and decompose. And during that 10-year period, they can interact with a lot of aquatic organisms when they're in a body of water. In addition to the toxic chemicals from the tobacco, the nicotine, and all these thousands of other toxic chemicals in the tobacco, the filter itself is made up of, as I said, plastic fibers. And as the cigarette butt, the filter decomposes, it releases microplastic fibers, which are one of the most common types of microplastics in the environment. Most of the microplastics in the environment are coming from clothing. And you think, clothing is releasing a lot more than cigarette butts, but cigarette butts do contribute to microfiber pollution. And the smoked filter is not only releasing microfibers, but a smoked filter has got a whole bunch of the chemicals that it absorbed from the tobacco that passed through it. The filter is to prevent some of these chemicals from getting into the smoker's lungs, and they get stuck on the cellulose fibers of the filter. But the toxicity of a cigarette butt is a combination of the chemicals that leach out into the water plus the microfibers. So it's the toxicity of the leachate alone is less than the leachate plus the microfibers. There have been effects shown on all sorts of organisms. Environmental levels of nicotine can impair the primary producers that are the base of the aquatic food chain. These are phytoplankton, which are the primary photosynthesizers in aquatic environments, and they get impaired by these, by nicotine. The leachate is also toxic to a wide range of aquatic animals, including zooplankton, frogs, snails, fish, just about anything. The organism called the water flea or Daphnia in this photograph is used commonly in toxicity testing. And this is particularly sensitive to nicotine, and which is the most toxic chemical for the Daphnia. They're also toxic to organisms in the soil. And I think this is the most perverse effect that it has. The leachate from smoked cigarette butts is toxic to the microorganisms that degrade the nicotine and the cellulose. So these are the very organisms we depend on to eventually degrade these toxic chemicals and so forth. And these are affected and inhibited by the chemicals, the very chemicals that they are supposed to be degrading. So I think this is one of the most perverse kinds of effects I've come across. In the cigarette butt itself, let me say in the cigarette itself, in the tobacco, there are about 4,000 chemicals. At least 50 of them are carcinogenic. That means they cause cancer, including tar, nicotine, and various phenols. And these will, of course, be concentrated in the filter, and the filters then filtered with the unsmoked stub of the cigarette end up in sewers or beaches and end up contaminating the water. One measurement of acute toxicity means measuring how much does it take to kill something, which is a very extreme measure. But one way of expressing how toxic it is called the LC50, which means the lethal concentration for 50%. So this is how much does it take to cause death of half the animals that you tested. And the LC50 for leachate from smoked filter with tobacco was about 1 butt per liter for 2 species of fish that were tested, the marine top smelt on the left and fathead minnow, which is a freshwater fish, on the right. So, however, the leachate from smoked cigarette filters, this is just the filter without the tobacco, was less toxic. The LC50 is higher. Note, LC50 being higher means less toxic. It takes more of the chemical in order to kill half the animals. So the higher the LC50, the less toxic the chemical or the substance is. I hope that's clear. Some people get confused about that. It takes a lot of the chemical to kill things. It's not very toxic. If it's only a little bit of the chemical and it kills half of the animals, then you've got something to really worry about. So the smoked cigarette filters with no tobacco are less toxic than the smoked cigarette filter with the tobacco attached. And then an unsmoked filter, that is a filter all by itself that hadn't been smoked with no tobacco, was the least toxic, and the LC50s are higher up. And you can note the LC50 for the fathead minnow is higher than the LC50 for the smelt, showing that the fathead minnow is less susceptible, is more resistant to it, less sensitive than the smelt. Now, I'm particularly interested really in sublethal effects. It's very seldom that you find levels in the environment that are killing half the animals. What is far more common is having levels in the environment where they're causing impairments in sublethal, affecting growth, affecting behavior, affecting embryo development. All these sorts of things are more sensitive and more likely to be seen. So exposure to smoked cigarette filters of this particular worm, this is a common burrowing on the bottom marine worm. The leachates in seawater at concentrations that are lower than what is found in urban runoff cause the worms to take a much longer time to burrow. Burrow is very important for these animals. When they're in there, when they've burrowed down in the mud, they're much less likely to be eaten by something than if they're swimming around in the water or crawling around on the surface of the mud. Following a 96-hour exposure to filter microfibers, the lowest concentration to affect burrowing time was 8 filters per liter. The lowest concentration to cause effect on growth was also 8 filters per liter. And those that were exposed to 8 seems to be the magic number in this study, had twice as much DNA damage as unexposed worms. And of course, those exposed to less had less DNA damage. DNA damage is of a concern because this relates to changing the genetic material, perhaps leading into cancer or mutations and so forth. An interesting thing was that the worms exposed to the microfibers in sediment had very little, no significant effect. So that's the presence of sediment decreased the effects a lot. So the conclusions from this general, very limited survey is that the toxicity comes from both the smoked tobacco, the toxic chemicals in the smoked tobacco, and the filter itself, the microfibers. The sediment can reduce toxicity, and sublethal effects on things like behavior and growth are very important for populations of marine and freshwater and terrestrial animals and plants. Well, plants don't have behavior, but sublethal effects are really very important. And I'm done.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Weiss, for that incredible presentation. Our next panelist is Dr. Stanton Glantz. Dr. Glantz recently retired after 45 years as a professor of medicine and founding director of the University of California, San Francisco Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education. He has published over 450 peer-reviewed papers and several books on cardiovascular research, secondhand smoke, e-cigarettes, and tobacco policy making. He served for 34 years on the California State Scientific Review Panel on Toxic Air Contaminants and is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. Dr. Glantz, hello. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It is our pleasure to have you. You have studied multiple issues related to e-cigarettes. There may be more media attention about health and environmental hazards of cigarette butts than e-cigarettes. So we would love it if you would tell us about e-cigarettes and especially how they're affecting our youth.
Okay, well, thank you. So I'm going to give a talk about just e-cigarettes in general. And one of the arguments, I mean, another speaker is going to speak to the issue of toxic waste from e-cigarettes, although I'll mention that. And one of the arguments that you often hear is that you can't do something that will discourage the use of e-cigarettes or increase the cost of e-cigarettes because they're so good for health, and because they're not attracting kids and they're helping smokers quit. And I'm going to show you that all of those arguments are wrong. So just to review how an e-cigarette works, this picture here is a third generation e-cigarette. It's called a mod. And they've been superseded by what are called pod systems that I'll show you in a minute, but I couldn't find a good diagram of a pod system. And the main difference between a cigarette and an e-cigarette is the way they generate the nicotine aerosol that you breathe in. Nicotine is a highly addictive drug. And what you do with a cigarette is you set the cigarette on fire. That generates smoke, which is an aerosol of ultrafine particles of nicotine. And when you inhale it, it carries the nicotine down deep into your lungs where it's rapidly absorbed and quickly goes to your brain where it stimulates your nervous system. The e-cigarette delivers a nicotine aerosol like a cigarette does, but it doesn't set anything on fire. It just heats up a liquid to generate the aerosol. And the argument is that because you don't have combustion, you don't have a fire, it's not as dangerous. And I'm going to show you that that's really an oversimplification. But this shows you the basic components of an e-cigarette. It has a battery to generate, that you turn on and off. There's a tank that contains the e-liquid, which is a mixture usually of propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, flavorings, and nicotine. There are wicks, kind of like a candle wick, that are soaked in the e-liquid, and they're usually surrounded by a coil, kind of like a mini toaster coil. And when you turn the e-cigarette on, the coil heats up the wick and generates the aerosol that you inhale. And just as an aside, because Mara works in Broadway, the propylene glycol is used for theater fog. But there's all kinds of warnings that come with it about limiting the use and don't breathe in too much of this. And with an e-cigarette, you're breathing in hot propylene glycol at much higher levels than you would if you were on a stage with some theater fog. The e-cigarettes have changed over time, and the newer e-cigarettes, pioneered by a brand called Juul, which was developed out here in San Francisco, are more addictive than the older e-cigarettes, or cigarettes for that matter. And the reason for that is that when you inhale smoke, or you inhale the e-cigarette aerosol from an older e-cigarette, the aerosol is quite alkaline, and it's actually quite hard to inhale. It triggers a gag reflex. And what the people who invented Juul figured out is that if you put a little acid in the e-liquid, you can lower the pH, the acidity, more toward neutral, and it makes it much, much easier to inhale the nicotine. And so you can deliver a higher dose of nicotine. And that's why these products are more addictive than a traditional cigarette, and why kids seem to get addicted to them a lot faster than they do with a cigarette, is because you can just get more nicotine into their body faster. And as you'll hear in more detail later, they generate lots of trash. There's probably more trash associated with an e-cigarette than a pack of conventional cigarettes. There's the device itself, which eventually gets thrown away. And the most popular brand right now, which is called Puff Bar, is a disposable device. You have the tank, which is filled with toxic chemicals. And then even if it's empty, there's a revenue. And then there's usually lithium batteries and electronics that just get thrown away. This is and you'll see this slide in one of the other presentations, and I'll go through it in more detail, but this shows a Puff Bar broken apart. And this is typical of the so-called pod systems, where the green thing, which looks kind of like a flash drive, it's about a couple inches, or maybe an inch or two long, maybe 3 inches. It's where the battery and the electronics are, and then there's a a pod, which is the black thing at the top, and you can't really see the clear case where the liquid is, and then the heater is in that. And in the puff bar system, the whole thing gets thrown away. In a pod systems like Joule, you only throw away the little container that has the heater and the e-liquid in it, but that's again plastic and toxic chemicals getting thrown on the ground. So I was asked to address 3 specific questions, and one was, what can you tell us about e-cigarettes as they affect youth? The first thing is that e-cigarettes are by far and away the dominant tobacco product used by kids. And the graph that you see at the bottom of this slide is national data collected by the CDC going from 2006 up to 2021. And the gray area at the top is cigarettes, conventional cigarettes. And you can see in this, if you go way back earlier, even than 2006, cigarette use had been falling among middle and high school students in the United States for a long time. When e-cigarettes came on the market in a big way around 2013 or 14, and that's the blue area at the bottom of the graph, the use rapidly increased among kids, and it really took over the market. The orange area is what's called dual use. That's kids who are using both cigarettes and e-cigarettes at the same time. And you can see that by about 2015, e-cigarettes had taken over or become the dominant product in the market. And today, even though use is down, probably because kids were locked at home with their parents during COVID, they still dominate the market among kids. Another thing that's important is kids use e-cigarettes a lot more than adults do. The percentage of kids who use e-cigarettes is almost 10 times higher than the percentage of adults who use e-cigarettes. And if you look at this graph, if you look at the left side, you can see that cigarette use was going down, but the advent of e-cigarettes really reversed that downward trend. And even with the big drop in e-cigarette use since 2019, probably because of COVID, we're still back about to where we were in 2013. So e-cigarettes have really reversed the progress we were making on youth nicotine addiction. And the other thing that's very important is because of the increased addictive nature of these products, because they're so easy to hide and they're so small, and the brilliant social marketing that Juul and the other e-cigarette companies have done, they've attracted a lot of kids who probably never would have picked up a cigarette, and they really are maintaining and expanding the tobacco epidemic. They're very, very bad for kids. Now, another thing you often hear is that, well, e-cigarettes help people quit smoking. And as you could see in the previous slide, when you talk about kids, among the kids who are using cigarettes, almost all of them are using e-cigarettes at the same time. And the other thing I said a couple minutes ago was e-cigarettes attract a lot of low-risk kids at low risk of smoking cigarettes. But then the question is, do they then go on and start smoking cigarettes? And this slide is what's called a meta-analysis, which is a fancy way to say a sort of summary and averaging of a bunch of independent studies. And these 17 studies, and there are more since I made this slide, or I actually took it out of a paper, a peer-reviewed paper some other people published. What they did was they took kids who had never smoked a cigarette and then but were using e-cigarettes, and followed them forward in time, usually for about a year. And then they asked, what are the chances that the kids had added cigarettes? And that ratio is called an odds ratio. And if using cigarettes, or pardon me, using e-cigarettes didn't increase the chances of smoking cigarettes, that number would be 1, which is the solid line in the middle of the graph. And you can see every single one of these studies found that the odds of smoking cigarettes a year or so later were increased among kids who were using e-cigarettes at baseline. And on average, based on these earlier studies, using e-cigarettes among kids who never smoked cigarettes about tripled the odds that they would go on and add cigarettes. There have been some newer studies since the advent of Juul and the products that add acid to the e-liquid, and those are finding the odds going up by a factor of 5 or 6. So the problem seems to be getting worse. Now, another question I got asked is, are e-cigarettes less harmful than cigarettes? Because as I said, you don't have any combustion. They just heat up the e-liquid rather than burning tobacco. But they're probably not less harmful than cigarettes. And the reason for that is breathing in ultrafine particles, which are the aerosol, together with the nicotine and the many other chemicals that are in e-cigarettes, is quite dangerous. And while they might be a little less cancer causing than a cigarette is because you don't have the combustion products, in terms of effects on heart disease and probably lung disease, where these particles and the toxic chemicals you're breathing in are having almost immediate effects, they're probably not much different from a cigarette. And it's heart and lung disease, not cancer, that kills most smokers. Now, getting cancer is not a good thing, and about 1/3 of the smokers die of cancer. But the dominant things that kill the smokers are heart and lung disease, and that's where the strongest documented effects of e-cigarettes are. There's a lot of evidence from experimental studies that e-cigarettes harm blood vessels just as much as cigarettes do. They shut down normal functioning of blood vessels, which is predictive of developing a heart attack. They increase erectile dysfunction, just like a cigarette does, because of these effects on blood vessels. They increase asthma and other respiratory problems in both youth and adults. And for youth, there's good evidence that kids who use e-cigarettes have more mental health and behavioral problems. And they have just become a complete nightmare for the schools because the kids are using them all over. You can buy hoodies which are designed that have hollow strings for the neck that you can inhale an e-cigarette and then blow the e-cigarette out through what looks like the spring, and it gets trapped in between the two pieces of fabric in the hoodie. The kids will do what they call stealth vape in school, where they put them in their hand and just go like this. And then when the schools confiscate these things, they end up with massive amounts of toxic waste that they can't just throw in the trash. And, even if they end up being a little bit less dangerous than a cigarette, they're still very, very dangerous. A cigarette is the most dangerous consumer product out there. And, what I tell people is maybe it's like jumping out of the 20th story of the building instead of the 30th story of the building, but it's still pretty bad. Is it true that e-cigarettes can help people quit smoking altogether? And the answer to that is quite convincingly no. You hear from the e-cigarette advocates that you can't restrict e-cigarettes because they're an off-ramp to cigarettes because they help addicted smokers quit. And there are probably 50 or 60 population level studies where you look at people in the population using e-cigarettes and you follow them forward in time, and you see, did they quit smoking cigarettes? And the answer is no, they keep people smoking. And this is another one of these meta-analyses. This is something we published in 2021, and every one of these lines or rows on this graph is a different study. And this is the odds of stopping smoking at 1. So if e-cigarettes helped smokers stop smoking, the study points would be like this one. They would be out above 1. But you can see that most of them are below 1. And when you average them all out, and these vertical or horizontal lines are what are called the 95% confidence intervals, or what pollsters call the margin of error. When you average them all out, you get that there's no association at all between using e-cigarettes in the real world and quitting smoking. And in fact, there were two recent studies that followed people for long. Most of these studies either were what are called cross-sectional studies, which is like a snapshot in time, or where they followed people forward, what's called a longitudinal study for 3 years, or 1 year, pardon me. But there were recently 2 very well done, huge studies involving 3,000 or 4,000 people, where they followed them forward in time for 3 years. And they found that e-cigarettes actually substantially depressed quitting. So they don't help smokers quit. And the most recent evidence is that they actually make it harder to quit. So the bottom line from all of this is that combustion is just not as important as we thought it was in terms of the toxicity of these inhaled nicotine products. There's been rapid youth uptake, and which has reversed progress in reducing tobacco use. They promote progression to cigarettes. They're not helping people quit. They're expanding the tobacco epidemic. And as you'll hear more in one of the other talks, they pollute the environment probably more than cigarettes do. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glantz, for that incredible information. I found that image of the 20th story versus the 30th story very, very convincing myself. Next, we have Christina Carell. Christina Carell is Educational Programs Director with Parents Against Vaping E-Cigarettes, or PAVE, and also Director of the Vapes Are Trash campaign. She is a health promotion and health communications consultant with over a decade of experience in global public health, with an emphasis on tobacco control education and communications. She earned her MPH from Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health and is a former Peace Corps volunteer serving in HIV/AIDS and community health in Ecuador. Christina, hello. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Your organization, Parents Against Vaping, has a website with a section called Vapes Are Trash, and the headline, Vapes Are Horrible for the Environment. So will you please share with us, how are they horrible for the environment? And I'd love to see what vape trash on the sidewalk looks like.
Yes, 1 moment. All right, you can see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Cool, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. As Mara said, I'm Educational Programs Director with Parents Against Vaping E-Cigarettes, an organization I'm so proud to work with, started by moms here in New York City in response to the youth vaping epidemic. And though we're a small but mighty team, since they formed in 2018, they've become really the national parent voice on this issue, doing a lot of great advocacy and education work. So please get in touch with me later if you want to talk about that at all. And I'm also the director of Parents Against Vaping's Vapes Are Trash campaign. So I'm going to go through some of what I've learned about environmental impacts of e-cigarettes through the development and management of that campaign. I just want to start out with some images. I know, I think all of us sort of think of e-cigarette or cigarette butts as being ubiquitous in the environment. They are the #1 most littered item. We see them on the street all the time. You may not realize how often e-cigarettes are also littered. I see them every time I go out to walk the dog. I live in northern Manhattan and Washington Heights, and all of these images were taken from there. And all of these vapes were taken from there. So we're sort of moving to the down and dirty portion of the presentation now. I just want to note, oh, sorry, stuck. As other presenters have said, a lot of these products are disposable e-cigarettes, meaning they contain about the amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes, or maybe more depending on the size. And they're meant to be used and then thrown away. So they're not only single-use plastics, but single-use electronic items. And as you can see, they're not built to last. You can see paint scraping off, the metal getting bent, the plastic caps coming off. You can see wires, batteries, the cotton wick all exposed and coming apart. Can you hear me okay? Yep, okay.
Yes.
And I want to thank Dr. Jeremiah Muck, who is a colleague garbologist who's done a study, one study in particular, looking at litter on a group of California high school campuses and analyzing the amount of tobacco and e-cigarette waste. And he's kindly pointed out all the parts of different components of e-cigarettes. So this is a jewel. I know Dr. Glantz also showed one example of a puff bar, which I also have here. But just to show, you know, when we talk about e-cigarettes, we are talking about a lot of the same stuff as with a cigarette, because nicotine, whether it's in tobacco leaves or liquid nicotine, is still a neurotoxin. It's, liquid nicotine is an EPA, acute hazardous waste. And we are talking about plastics as we are with filters, but you're also talking about other types of plastics, metals, wiring, heavy metals in the heating coil devices, and other substances in e-liquids. So pods are, you know, one type of e-cigarette uses these flavor pods, which are like small capsules that stick on the end of the device. There's a glare, you can see them. These are a few different brands, but they contain a small amount of e-liquid, again, typically about the equivalent of a pack of cigarettes worth of nicotine. And when you finish it, you throw that away and replace it. So someone who's doing this regularly may use one or more per day. And it seems like a small item, but as you can see, there are a lot of components of it, including plastic, metal, and residue of that e-liquid, which contains toxic substances. So Puff Bar, as Stan was saying, is one of the most popular brands among young people. And this is an example of a disposable product, like I said, which is meant to be used and then discarded. So some of them are made of metal, some are made of plastic on the outside. They still all have, almost all have a lithium ion battery, plastic parts on the mouthpiece on the end, these cotton and plastic pieces inside, and wiring. And this is just a shot of some of the stuff that I've collected in my neighborhood. I encourage people to look down, especially in gutters on the edge of the sidewalk as you walk, and you'll probably start to notice these. I just wanted to give an example of, this is one type of device as it sort of breaks down. So these three things are actually all the same type of device, and I have them right here. It's called an air bar. And the one on the left is, you know, not very far broken down. The second one is getting gross with the mouthpiece broken off and some wiring exposed. And then the one on the right is with the whole exterior casing broken off. So you still see the battery and the inside parts, but like I said, these things are not meant to last. They are breaking down, but they're accumulating. They're not biodegradable. These things are going to stay in the environment and be harmful. So like I was saying, similar to cigarettes, we have nicotine. And we have plastics, but there are also heavy metals in the wiring and the heating coils, including lead, arsenic, cadmium, chromium, nickel. There are lithium-ion batteries, which is something to consider sort of in the bigger picture. There are a lot of things that use lithium-ion batteries now, like e-bikes and electric vehicles. But we're talking about products that are meant to be used and thrown away. So the amount, especially of these disposable e-cigarettes, is a lot to think about, especially given a finite amount of materials like lithium and these mined heavy metals. So for disposables specifically, I don't know the sales overall, but there's convenience store data available from the CDC Foundation, which reports monthly sales of these products. So that doesn't include vape shops, it doesn't include online sales, but from convenience stores alone, there are up to 10 million sold per month, only of disposables. They're meant to be used and discarded. And again, they're the most popular devices now among teens. They come in all sorts of flavors. Something that's telling, I think, they're cheap, they're underregulated, they're accessible to young people. In New York, flavored e-cigarettes are not legal, but obviously there's a huge enforcement issue because everything that I'm showing you, basically everything I'm showing you is flavored e-cigarettes that were purchased in New York. So I think it's good to think about where these end up, depending on how you discard them. If they're littered, obviously they may end up on the sidewalk outside and make their way into waterways. There's a risk of consumption by wildlife. I know Dr. Novotny mentioned cases of consumption by kids and pets. There are also documented cases of kids and pets consuming and being harmed or killed by e-cigarette liquids and components. And even if they aren't consumed, they break down, they accumulate, and they can leach out chemicals. So if they're thrown in the regular household trash or household recycling, they eventually will be landfilled or incinerated. They're such small products, they're sort of just a waste management nightmare. I've spoken with New York City, the Department of Sanitation, and their hazardous waste contractor. And even if these were to make it to a hazardous waste facility, at least in New York, the majority of it is still going to be incinerated. They can, in most cases, remove the lithium-ion battery and recycle that to the extent that it's possible, but the other parts are still being incinerated. So just to recap, as a waste management issue, nicotine is an acute hazardous waste per the EPA. So these products count as both hazardous waste and electronic waste. They're a fire risk. There are EPA reports on the amount of fires that are caused in waste management facilities by lithium-ion batteries. So it's really great that I'm surrounded by them on my desk right now. And then this also can be a problem, as Dan mentioned, for schools, because they can become classified as large quantity generators of hazardous waste from confiscating them from students and from the litter that's in parking lots and on campuses, because again, this is hazardous waste. There's been a lack of federal guidance. These are so difficult to deal with. I'll show on the next page what FDA has in terms of guidance, but it's mostly instructing people to defer to their local and state level authorities. If you were to rinse them out or dump things in the sink, the water that contains e-liquid then becomes hazardous waste. So that's also difficult to deal with. And just to mention, for New York City, the sort of proper way to dispose of them, or what's recommended, is to take these into safe events, which are periodically held for each borough for household hazardous waste, which, having spoken with people that handle that, I know that they get a very small amount, which is what you would expect. And I think given the amount of young people who are vaping, it seems even less feasible that someone who's probably hiding this from their parents is going to know about this being the proper way to do it, intend to take them in, save up all of their vapes, and then, travel to take them to a site in order to be handled by a hazardous waste facility. But at the end of the day, as I was saying in the previous slide, they almost all end up getting incinerated or landfilled regardless. So this is from the FDA's FDA tips for safe disposal of e-cigarettes and e-liquid waste. Like I said, it's a little bit vague and mostly tell people to defer to what's going on locally. They suggest you turn off the device, you remove the battery. But again, when we're talking about disposable e-cigarettes, the battery is not meant to be removed. We never, from PAVE or the Vapes or Trash campaign, would suggest to anyone that they should take these apart. We don't suggest handling them. I don't touch any of these without gloves. Leave them in their baggies.
Christina, I'm going to jump in just to give you a 1-minute warning.
Okay. So anyway, there's a lack of federal guidance. And I just want to point out the Vapes or Trash campaign. So we're on Instagram and vapesortrash.org. Overall, the campaign is exposing the human and environmental impacts of e-cigarettes on the tobacco industry. We're going to be at Union Square tomorrow at the Earth Day Festival from noon to 7. So if you're in the city, please come visit us. And I just want to point out really quickly, we're really focused right now on sort of post-consumer waste part of this, but the environmental impacts of e-cigarettes in the tobacco industry stretch far beyond that. And in the campaign, we really try to encourage young people to think about what happens before a vape is in your hand and what happens after. So if we're thinking of environmental impacts of this stuff, we have to think about the deforestation due to tobacco farming, which is significant. We have to think about mining, exploitative practices in mining and farming, as well as the post-consumer stuff. Okay. Here's a bit about our event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. And yes, what a very important point at the end, that we have to look at the full life of these products. This is our last panel section on policy and the proposed bill. We have Justin Flagg and Kevin Brady with us. Justin Flagg is Director of Communications and Environmental Policy for New York State Senator Liz Krueger. Justin has been involved with several key statewide environmental victories, including bans on plastic bags and styrofoam packaging, passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and divestment of the New York State Pension Fund from fossil fuels. Kevin Brady serves as legislative counsel to Assemblywoman Judith Griffin from the 21st Assembly District on Nassau County's South Shore. Kevin graduated in 2020 from the City University of New York School of Law's evening program with a background in mediation and policy, while working full-time as the secretary to a judge in the Nassau County Supreme Court. Kevin previously served as a district representative for State Senator Anna Kaplan, as a board member of the Long Island Progressive Coalition, an affiliate of Citizen Action, and was a co-founder of the Nassau County Bar Association's LGBTQ committee. Liz Krueger in the New York State Senate and Judy Griffin in the Assembly introduced a bill entitled the Tobacco Product Waste Reduction Act. Justin and Kevin, thank you so much for being with us today. And will you please tell us about this bill and its current status?
Sure. Thank you for having us, and thank you to all the other folks who've really laid out the case for this bill quite clearly. I won't take too long because, now that we understand the problem, I think the solution is simple. That being said, just because something is simple doesn't mean it's easy, but it is simple at this point. For all the reasons that I think Tom pointed out, it seems to Senator Krueger certainly that the appropriate policy approach for this is a ban. Education doesn't work, litter laws don't work, take back policies are infeasible, biodegradable options are not feasible, and they have other problems because of the accumulation of toxins in them. So this is an appropriate place for a ban in terms of a public policy approach, and that is what we carry. This bill, the Tobacco Product Waste Reduction Act, we introduced in January of 2020. I will admit that we stole it. We stole the idea from California. I told Kevin earlier today that they say that amateurs borrow and professionals steal. So I'm owning up that is what we did. We made some changes. I believe the California bill at that time didn't include e-cigarettes. We also added e-cigarettes as the California bill later did. And what this bill does is three things. It bans the sale of cigarettes with filters. It bans the sale of these sort of plastic disposable filters that you get on like cigarillos or cigars, and it bans the sale of disposable e-cigarettes. And that is basically the long and short of it. It is enforced by a fine. It would go into effect in January of 2023. And those are the key elements. At the moment, the bill is in committee. It's sort of at the starting gun. We introduced it in 2020, and then obviously several things happened, and legislators got distracted. So the bill hasn't moved since then. And I'll pass it to Kevin, and he can discuss a little bit of the political situation.
Thank you very much, Justin. And it's one of the rare examples where the folks from government are going to talk less than the experts from other things. And that's because we are experienced enough to know who's really in their depth here and who is more just the caretakers and the vessels. And in this case, that is the legislators. I know I actually said to Justin earlier, I have tremendous respect for the utter just depth of knowledge on policy of his senator, his boss, Liz Kruger on this. I know those are the words of my own Assemblywoman as well, who is a former Senate staffer who became an Assemblywoman in her own right, running on environmental issues in her district, which was relatively recently now joined the majority. So I want to note that I put the links to both bills. Don't worry, Justin, the Senate and the Assembly, you have a better website than we do. But if you notice in the chat, I did put the links into both bills there, because now is the time. For those of you who are joining us from New York City, particularly Manhattan, but obviously from all over the place, I have folks beaming in from California and others, but for those of you who are New York residents, and in particular New York City residents, which is going to be the largest part of who's an audience here, see if your member in the Assembly and in the Senate is signed on as a sponsor. If they are not, it doesn't mean you should yell at them, because we just came out of a very heated budget season, as you may have noticed, that included a tremendous amount of spending and opportunity on making huge investments on the environmental programs New York needs. But now we pivot back to legislation for 6 weeks, reaching out to your respective Assembly members and senators to say, hey, I care about this bill. Here's the bill number. This is my address. I care because X, Y, and Z, and fill in your personal reasons. That's what will motivate people to join onto our bills. In addition, we'll do plenty of discussion with our own colleagues in different offices to say, this bill is very important and here's why, please join. But the most important thing that can happen is when those of you who are constituents of your own districts reach out to your members. You'll notice on the Assembly side, it's Judy Griffin from Nassau County, Jessica Gonzalez Rojas from Queens, and Assemblywoman Chantel Jackson from the Bronx. I know the Senate as well is going to try and also build a diverse coalition of members from different backgrounds in different parts of the state. So those of you who can use your voice to reach out to your individual member, that's where it's most important. It's lovely when I get calls from people in New York City or upstate to tell my member that they love their bill, but tell your members and then say it's a great bill, please sign on. And that's some of the biggest things you can do right now, because whether it's to build up a head of steam and we pass some of these bills out of committee the next 6 weeks, or to be candid, if it's about coming back in January and starting all over again, everything is about momentum and who we add on, because even a co-sponsor who joins now to a bill that we need to come back to maybe next year, they stick with the bill next year as well. So that's where you can really ask your members to say, you know, this is another bill and a great bill. I'd really love you to co-sponsor it, and make sure you can find your members if you have difficulty with that. I know they put a link in there, so thank you, L'Oreal, to find your member, and make sure you share the bill numbers with the offices when you reach out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Justin and Kevin, for working on our behalf to get this on the floor and get this bill passed. Well, while our brilliant panelists have been speaking, a very lively chat with some phenomenal questions have come up for all of our panelists. So I am going to pass it over to Joyce Bialik and Ellen Cooper to run the Q&A portion, which will go until about 7:15.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions, so we're gonna jump right in. So Will Kane, you had a couple of questions, but one I think was, really important for this group. So why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. Hi, my name's Will. I'm here in New York City, right above Central Park. And my question is, there's a lot of research showing microplastic showing up in the human bloodstream. What data do we have about cigarette waste, whether it be filter microplastics, whether it be tobacco offshoots, whether it be other carcinogens appearing in the human bloodstream?
I can take a first crack at that. We don't have that information as related to tobacco product waste, to discarded butts. We do have some really interesting information about third-hand smoke, for instance, where there is smoke that is, where there's been smoking in an indoor environment, and we can find the chemicals on surfaces, and we can also find chemicals in people who have been exposed to these surfaces, who are non-smokers, who have never been smokers, even when, in places where there's never been a smoker for years. These things don't go away. So, we do know from other kind of residual studies that these chemicals can get into the human organism. And also we're doing a paper right now also on just wiping kids' hands who have been in places where there has been smoking in the past, and finding being able to detect these chemicals. But for tobacco product waste, I don't have any information on that detection as yet.
And I guess a follow-up not only for you, but for others, what kind of study have the scientists done to say that microplastics are in the human bloodstream? Because maybe we could do something equivalent for cigarette waste and offshoots.
I have seen some articles about identifying microplastics in human lungs, aerosolized, and that I know happens. I'm not sure about drinking water sources for this. Maybe Judith has a little more information on that. You're muted, Judith. You're still muted. You're muted, Judith.
Okay. I know that microplastics are found in drinking water, both bottled water and tap water. The techniques for finding microplastics are totally different than techniques for looking for nicotine. And I don't know, it's clear, when people are inhaling cigarettes, that the chemicals in the cigarettes are going to get into their lungs. I mean, that's the whole point of smoking. So I'm not sure that's answering your question, but that's.
No, I'm asking it for a very particular reason. So I have a project called the Cigarette Art Project, and the whole idea is to turn all the data from this conversation into actually visceral art that not only causes people to learn, but to feel. Because saying cigarettes will cause cancer on the back of labels, while nice, isn't making the difference that we want it to. But maybe art in a visceral sense can. So the more data we have, and the more grimy, scary data we have, the more effective the campaign can be.
For now, the evidence on human effects is still, a work in progress, and I think more needs to be done on that. I want to mention one other study that was important in the San Francisco Bay Area. The Estuary Institute analyzed urban runoff, which means water that goes flushing from streets down into streams and into the bay, and they found cellulose acetate in that urban runoff as the most common microfiber chemical, meaning that it's probably cigarettes to a large extent, because the other sources of cellulose acetate are like eyeglasses, of photographic film, and rayon, which are unlikely to be squashed onto the pavement and then end up into the storm drains. So, more needs to be done to be able to differentiate the source of that cellulose acetate, but there at least is some evidence that it gets into the aquatic biome.
Okay, thanks, Will, for that great question. Okay, Sharon Silverman will be the next person speaking.
Hi, everyone. I am part of the Manhattan Solid Waste Advisory Board, and I chair the Textile Waste Committee. But my question here, and has been all along as I've been more involved with this cigarette and vape waste outreach, was why hasn't the EPA or FDA banned filters for public health concerns and environmental and food chain harms? And relatedly, are there any or have there been any class action lawsuits concerning the false advertising that markets filtered cigarettes as being safer when the truth is actually the opposite? And that's for everybody. That's for the whole panel.
I've got a couple of things I can add, and Stan, I'm sure, has got even more. There have been judgments in the past. George Glass Kessler, back in the mid 2000s, ordered that the tobacco industry could no longer advertise light and low tar cigarettes. Those words are no longer able to be used because they deceived the public. There was corrective action that was ordered on these things, mainly related to the fact that they've been advertising these as something safer, cigarettes through light and low tar concepts. So that's one kind of judgment that has been made. And there was actually, the judgment was based on organized crime statutes, that they lied about not only the nicotine addictiveness, but also about the light and low tar benefits. So that's happened. And as far as a class action suit against the industry, I don't think that that's happened, although there have been inquiries from a number of lawyers about this being a possibility related to the environment. In terms of the FDA's regulatory authority, that only came about in 2010, and all of the cigarettes that are on the market before then were sort of grandfathered in. They're not going to be, changed by the EPA, by the FDA rather. And it's new products, though, can be, and they are required to have an environmental impact assessment before approving them. But the unfortunate thing is that the FDA's environmental impact assessments are usually reported by the industry rather than by, external environmental scientists. Stan may have more to say about that.
That would be a huge conflict of interest, wouldn't it?
No kidding.
Well, the FDA has, even though the law explicitly says the FDA is supposed to consider environmental impacts, their environmental reviews on these products have been very perfunctory, basically saying they don't think it's enough of a problem to worry about. There's a threshold written into the law that if something has, I don't know the exact words, but a minimal impact, they can just say, we don't think this has enough impact to worry about. So I would say this is one more example of how the FDA has really been a disaster when it comes to tobacco product regulation. Also, just to correct one thing Tom said, the products that were on the market as of 2007, I think it is, were grandfathered in the FDA law, and that they don't require FDA approval to continue marketing them. But there's nothing preventing FDA from issuing what's called a product standard that covers even the old products. And the FDA could issue a product standard, saying, no filters if they wanted to. But, they haven't. They were supposed to put graphic warning labels on cigarettes within a year or two of the 2009 law passing, and here it is 13 years later, and they still haven't done it. And their regulation of e-cigarettes has been a disaster. And, the place that we're making progress on these issues is at the state and local level. And the law explicitly gives states and communities authority to regulate the time, nature, and sale or manner of sale of tobacco products. And these laws, like the butt laws, it's very important when you write it that you can't write, a state cannot pass a product standard. So a state cannot say cigarettes can't have filters. That would be a violation of the FDA law. But the state could say we are prohibiting the sale of cigarettes with filters. And that's been litigated many times now. on the issue of flavor bans on the sale of flavored tobacco products in his law, including in New York City. And, the courts have consistently held that the law explicitly gives states and localities the authority to regulate the sale of the products, but not the products themselves. So for the legislative people on the call here, you need to really, I would look very carefully at the language in the flavor ban laws and make sure you follow that. So because the industry, if this law somehow manages to get passed, I can guarantee you that tobacco companies are going to sue on the grounds that it's preempted by the federal law. But if you're very clear that it is about regulating the sale of the products rather than the products, then you can move forward. But I've kind of given up on waiting for the FDA to do anything, frankly.
So yeah, I don't know if other panelists want to weigh in on this, what the two of you have already talked about, but would the insurance companies be concerned with the health effects because they're paying the premiums for people with
the insurance companies are, and a lot of insurance companies have surcharges for smokers. They have surcharge, when businesses ban smoking, a lot of them saw their fire insurance rates drop. And in fact, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, actually specifically allows surcharges for tobacco users. The tobacco companies are actually mounting a big rearguard action, claiming that that's a bad idea because it hurts smokers. But no, the insurance industry is a way into this. And the other thing to look at is are the costs associated with cleaning up this mess, and the pollution costs are going to be reflected in higher government costs, and businesses might be able to be mobilized again, to support these restrictions as a way to lower broad costs. Or to reduce their toxic disposal costs if they've got to deal with this in their business locations.
So our consumer tax.
Sharon, excuse me, Sharon, I think we should go to another question now.
I could go
Okay.
on.
I know Ellen has another one she wants to ask.
The question will be from Elena Kromeyer from Rutgers.
Yes, hi. Thanks for this wonderful panel discussion. This question is more for Dr. Novotny. So as a pioneer and seasoned advocate on this issue, what advice would you give researchers, advocates, and New York residents like me to get the Tobacco Product Waste Reduction Act on other advocates and power players' radar, because it's currently not?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, you're getting in touch with one's, representative is going to be the first thing. And the more they hear from many people and from different kind of perspectives, I think that that's going to be the biggest issue. But, I think the other thing is important is to anticipate what the tobacco industry is going to do and what they've done in California, for instance. And that is they're going to say, well, we're going to go next door. People are going to go next door to New Jersey and buy cigarettes and import them into New York under black market kind of conditions. And they're going to go to the Indian reservations and buy the, filtered cigarettes. And, that's going to reduce the economics of sales. And then the small businesses are also going to get, mobilized to act out against the bill because it's going to reduce their revenues. And so it's important to work with the known adversarial arguments and the groups, especially those that are going to be, energized by the tobacco industry as front groups, and to anticipate that and to work on those issues because they're going to appear. And, I think there's plenty of history to show how that will happen. So that, I think, is really an important thing to look down the line as to the resistance that's going to be brought forward. Also, the Chamber of Commerce, they're the other actors on this. And perhaps businesses who are members of the Chamber of Commerce need to be brought into the consideration to, change that perspective. But nationally, the Chamber of Commerce is one of the most heavily funded by the tobacco industry in and of itself.
Yeah, especially for the academics on the call, but for everyone, there's a wonderful paper. It's a little bit theoretical, but it's called the Policy Dystopia Model. And it's by someone named Anna Gilmore. If you just search Gilmore Dystopia, it will pop up. And they looked at tobacco industry efforts to oppose advertising restrictions and taxes around the world and found, very common strategies used everywhere. And we've actually shown that it applies for clean indoor air and other things. And they have a great appendix that is like a compendium of front organizations that the industry's worked with in these plans. And basically, the argument that the tobacco companies use against this, as they do all public health policies, is that if you pass this policy, the sky will fall. And, they never talk about how it will hurt their business. It's always, it will hurt small business. It will cause unemployment. It will cause crime. And I mean, because the tobacco companies just can't be seen to the public, and the politicians don't want to be seen as affiliated with the tobacco industry because everybody hates the tobacco companies. So they always work through third parties and front groups, and they use and they gin up all of these other arguments. But the sort of the good news is that they always do exactly the same thing. So if you look at how they've opposed other bits of legislation, somebody just put the link in the chat. That's great. It's a wonderful kind of primer on what to expect. And Anna is quite, in addition to being an excellent academic, is a very effective campaigner. And the other thing that, in fact, she's at the University of Bath in England. They have a website called tobaccotactics.org, which they keep track of industry front groups and allies. And so if some odd person shows up, you should go to that website, put the name of the person or organization, and to see where else they've been carrying water for the tobacco industry.
And if I could just chime in, I think definitely, in addition to what they have said, we need to get to that point. At this point, I think, as I said earlier, we're really at the starting gate with this bill, to the point that we haven't even attracted opposition yet, because there isn't enough interest. And I'm certainly not an organizer or an advocate, but I've been on the other side, and I have seen the organization and the advocacy, and I've seen the issues get elevated. And I think it's sort of a bit of alchemy. It's not really a science, but you want to kind of strike lightning, and you need to be prepared to do that. And that just requires the groundwork to get a kind of grassroots interest in this, so that legislators hear about it, so that larger advocacy organizations hear about it and get interested in it, and also think that it is something that is feasible, that could move, including public health advocacy organizations. Because at the moment, I think this is primarily viewed as an environmental issue. And as we've heard tonight, it is also a public health issue. And then you kind of have to dig in for the long haul. And from my point of view, you never quite know when when the time has come for an issue. We carried a bill to ban styrofoam packaging for like 15 years. And then last year it just passed like that. I don't even know what happened. We were not heavily involved in the push for it. It just suddenly it was time for it. And advocates were ready, and the experts were ready, and we knew what to do, and we passed it. I'm not saying that will happen with this. And a lot of that is stuff you don't see. It's years of organizing. And as much as this is an urgent issue for all the reasons we've heard tonight, there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done to kind of get things moving, at least in New York State. And then, you need to be prepared for all of that opposition. But first, I think you've got to get some momentum going, which is what's happening here. I mean, this is one of the steps to doing that.
Yes, I agree, Justin. And I'm so glad to see so many people here. And I'm hoping that we can all get together and united to work on this campaign and move it forward. And hopefully we'll achieve something sooner than later, but we don't want to give up. We do have another question from Diane Orr. Diane, are you ready?
Thank you, Diane Orr, Manhattan SWAB also, and I appreciate everything we've heard tonight. Dr. Novotny, perhaps you can answer this. It's really not a broad question. It's more of a detail question. I finally do understand after the discussion tonight, the filters themselves are made of one chemical, one plastic, but it's through the smoking process that they become more toxic. In Liz Kruger's original bill, I can quote a line, but it's not that important. I just want to know very detailedly, when we get accumulation, including arsenic, cadmium, toluene, ethylphenol, are these coming from the tobacco themselves and then found in the filter? Could you just be clear about that?
I think, the filter has some toxicity. Judith mentioned the fish killing study that we actually did here at SDSU. And 1 cigarette butt in a liter of water kills half the fish with the smoked filter, with the remnant tobacco with an unsmoked filter. It takes 8 cigarette butts, that is unsmoked filters, to kill half the fish. So there is a toxicity. Now, the stuff in the filter is cellulose acetate plus plasticizers. It's kind of glued together to these fibers. So there are some other chemicals in there, like toluene, I think would be part of it. And I can't remember the others, but I'll try to look that up and make sure, try to get that to you somehow. But yeah, there are some other chemicals, but the vast majority, with the carcinogens especially, and the nicotine, of course, and the metals, are relative to the tobacco smoke having gone through the filter and causing it to be so much more toxic. There's been a lot of stuff looked at in the laboratory on this, but again, it's hard to make that connection between the lab to the environment and the human as yet, but it's coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we also have a question from Meredith. I see your hand up.
Hi. Yes, thank you. It's Meredith Berkman. I'm a co-founder of Parents Against Vaping. And I'm really thought this was fascinating, and thank you for including us in this. I guess the question is, and I put this in the chat, when we talk about divesting from fossil fuel companies, et cetera, I would love to hear what some of the panelists, it's called Parents Against Vaping e-cigarettes, someone's asking, and that's parentsagainst.vaping.org. Christina presented about our Vapes Are Trash campaign. But my question is about whether panelists think that we should be viewing the tobacco industry as as an industry from which corporations and certainly pension funds run by New York State, New York City, teachers unions, et cetera, we should be divesting from them in the same way that we look at the fossil fuel companies, et cetera, because of the huge environmental harm. We like to think about this environmental issue as very, very important for teens in particular, because we're a parent organization that seeks to engage kids rather than hearing that it's bad for their health. And also we wonder if this is in the same way that they got Al Capone in prison for murder, not for murder, but for tax evasion. Is this potentially the tax evasion issue for the tobacco industry? By getting people to divest because of the environmental harm, can we somewhat defang the tobacco industry's incredible damage?
Yeah.
Wow.
This is Stan, there's been a very active movement for tobacco divestment, and a lot of universities and other institutions the state of California pension fund, for example, is divested from tobacco. And there's actually an organization called Tobacco Free Funds, which is a global organization which is working to get pension funds and others to divest from tobacco. In fact, they have a representative in New York, which if somebody, I can put you in touch with them. But if you just go on the web, I'm pretty sure their website is tobaccofreefunds.org. But that's been a very active movement for at least 20 years. Yeah, somebody, Meredith, I guess, put it in there, tobaccofreefunds.org. I would just check that out.
The other thing
I would actually
you
urge you
introduced us
guys
to
to make common cause with them, because I do think the environmental angle on this is something that hasn't been pushed in the divestment debate as much as it could be.
And along with that, just want to make the point that the tobacco industry has not, is already ahead of us when it comes to environmental groups, because they have funded probably 30 major environmental groups, including the Ocean Conservancy, which organizes the annual butt cleanup, because that's a nice downstream thing that they get people to clean up their mess for them. And so Nature Conservancy, Ocean Conservancy, Keep America Beautiful, anything that's called Keep Something Tidy is all tobacco industry funded. So it's important to understand their kind of conflict of interest on this as well.
Thank you for reminding us.
And to press those organizations to stop taking tobacco.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. There's also, just to add, I know that I think TerraCycle has a partnership with RJ Reynolds.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think we have a few more questions, but I also think that it's time for us to close and give our closing thank yous, because we in the Manhattan, and we're also joined by Brooklyn and Queens swabs, are so pleased to have our expert panelists with us, as well as so many of the rest of you who are listening and talking and asking questions and commenting in the chat and learning about a very big problem that we need to continue to work on. Let's listen to Justin's message. Let's organize. And of course, also Kevin's. Let's get to our individual state legislators. Let's talk to our friends to do the same. We have a lot of work ahead of us, a lot of organizing. Let's work together as a group and see if we can call ourselves a coalition, because coalitions make a big difference as well. So we'll be coming around and asking you if you want to join us, multiple swabs. And Mara, thank you also so much. Thank you, Tom Novotny. Thank you, Judith Weiss. Thank you, Stanton Glantz. Thank you, Christina Correll. And thank you so much, Mara. You're a great
This has been my
actor.
pleasure.
And I think we have Matt Savello to give us a closing.
I just
Another-
want to